Hi, my name's Sean from One Earth Landscaping, Education and Consulting. I've been living on this magnificent property for the last 20 years and have transformed the property from just cow pasture into a beautiful property full of wildlife and full of food. I have about 74 frog ponds in now, and I have edible things all throughout the garden. I have fruit trees and bush foods and vegetables and herbs and whole range of edible things all through the garden, of which I get to eat and of which the birds and the other animals get to eat as well. So I love to share that produce with my friends and my family, but also with the animals. The whole focus for this property was to bring as many animals as possible into the system. So the property is based on permaculture principles, but I don't have things like goats or sheep or chickens or pigs in the system. I have native animals in the system, and my focus is about them predominantly. I grow a lot of food, but a lot of the food I do grow does get eaten by the animals as well. So, and that for me is a bit of a joy, seeing that. Also have about 15 bird baths in as well, and that brings in a huge amount of bird activity, as well as frogs breeding in those bird baths as well. I have about 3 of those bird baths that regularly breed frogs. They usually would be a tree frog, because a ground dwelling frog wouldn't come up into that and access it, but a tree frog would climb up the side of a bird bath and lay eggs in there, no problems at all. So this month the article I wrote was on frogs and tadpoles. Look, frogs and tadpoles are best left where you find them, but if you look, it's reality is kids and adults are curious, and they're going to want to explore frogs and tadpoles. They're going to want to catch them and watch them turn into frogs, and I'm all for that, but I'm also mindful that the frog gets returned back to the water that it's come from, or the tadpole gets put back in the water before it becomes a frog. So very much encourage children to collect those animals and observe them and learn about them, because for me that's how I learnt all of my knowledge as a kid, by observation. I was very fortunate to have parents that allowed me to keep a whole range of animals, and I had everything from turtles and snakes and frogs and lizards and birds and lots of insects. And so I think it's really important for children to have that knowledge and to get that understanding of how the natural world works. But I do also encourage that those frogs go back to nature when they've become a frog. I had a lady come to me a few years ago because she'd collected a tadpole with her children in the bush somewhere. She'd come to my house because she's like, we went back to release the frog into the pond, and the pond was dried up, so we didn't know what to do. In that regard, that species was most likely from a temporary water supply. So again, as an adult, it doesn't need the water as an adult unless it's breeding. So even if you find that tadpole in a pond somewhere and you take it home and it becomes a frog, re-release it back to the same location, the bush you found it, because it doesn't need that water. It needs that water only when it breeds again as an adult. So it may be many years until it needs that water again. Remember, frogs aren't hanging around the ponds. It's dangerous around a pond. So frogs are actually out in the landscape, up in trees, in ground covers, grasses and shrubs. They're not actually hiding in the pond itself. They might be around the pond, but they're not in the water. As soon as they become an adult, they leave the water. No reason for them to go back to that water again until they become a breeding adult. That could be many years down the track, depending on the species. So in some circumstances, I mentioned, some circumstances frogs are taken from the environment and also brought to a location where their species doesn't exist at all. So if you release those frogs in your property or in your garden and that species doesn't exist in that landscape or in that area, in that suburb say, then there's a good chance you'll have that species just die away again, because they won't be able to breed up numbers, because that's not the kind of situation they'd like. Or for instance, some species of frogs live right on the coast, and if I brought them inland, they wouldn't like it here, and vice versa. Some frogs live up in the mountains more, and they don't live down here, say. So again, I've got to be careful how I'm moving things around, but if I'm going to take that frog, I really want to reintroduce it back to where I found it again. It's really important. If raising tadpoles, say you have taken some tadpoles from the wild, and you brought them home and you have no food supply for them, the easiest, most efficient way of feeding them would be to get lettuce leaves, papaya, silver beet, rocket. You can steam those leaves, and when you steam the leaves, they basically destroys the cell of the leaf, which makes them available for the tadpole to eat instantly. You can do the same thing and put that leafy green in the water, but you'll wait 4 or 5 days before it actually is available to be eaten by that tadpole. So you can either freeze the lettuce leaf or you can steam it. I prefer to steam it because it's much quicker, and I then put that little bit of water and the steamed lettuce leaves into the water, and the tadpoles within minutes, they're all over that leaf. If I put that same fresh leaf in, it'd be 4 or 5 days before they could even eat it. So another thing that some people have problems with is they put too much leaf litter in the water, and the water can become anaerobic, meaning no oxygen. And if there's no oxygen in the water, you can kill the tadpoles. So make sure you don't put too much in there, just put enough in there that keeps them fed. So you could put in 2 big lettuce leaves every couple of days, and that would be enough, depending on how many tadpoles you have in the water. If you have got a big area and you've got 100 or 1,000 tadpoles, you're going to need to feed them more often. But if you've only got, say, 10 tadpoles, just a lettuce leaf every couple of days would be fine for them. But generally I don't feed them. I generally prefer for them to be naturally bred into a pond that I've created, and for those tadpoles to naturally eat the algae that's growing in the pond, for them to naturally then become a frog and leave that pond. So I prefer to not touch the tadpoles, not touch the eggs, just observe what species is bred there and observe. Sometimes I go out at night time and I'll sit in the pond and I'll watch, or sit near the pond and I'll watch what frogs are breeding around that pond that night, and then I'll go back the next morning and see if I can find spawn for that frog. And then it gives me a better understanding of what species of frog likes what particular type of pond, and also what sort of species, what their spawn looks like, because they've got quite unique ways in which they breed. So again, I'm trying to understand. Some small frogs are going to just lay a few eggs or a small bunch of eggs, whereas some might have a large white spawn. Again, if you read the article this month, there's some pictures of some frog spawn in there, so it might give you an idea. It's usually 3-dimensional on the surface, has little black dots all through it. Now generally all those eggs are fertile, but some of them don't get fertilized. So what happens, the tadpoles, when they first breed, when they first leave the egg, they come up underneath all that spawn, and that's what they'll eat first. So they'll eat that spawn and they'll eat any eggs that haven't been fertilized. Then they'll go off and eat algae. But they'll eat algae predominantly, but they also will eat each other. They'll also eat a frog. If a frog drowns in the pond, they'll eat the frog. If an insect jumps into the pond and drowns and starts to decompose, they'll eat it. I even had a lady come to one of my workshops and she said to me that she saw tadpoles eating a dead wallaby in the creek. So tadpoles are survivors. They will eat a lot of different things to survive, but they generally eat algae. But there is definitely a spectrum. They'll eat a lot more things to survive if they have to. As a general rule, I would always suggest 1 tadpole per 1 litre of water. So if you've got 50 tadpoles, don't put 50 tadpoles in a 20-litre tank or a 20-litre bucket, because eventually they'll run out of water and they're gonna eat each other as well. So minimum 1 litre per tadpole. It's really important. I've gone away as a kid and I put 50 tadpoles in a pond, in a bucket, and I've come back a few days later and their numbers have greatly reduced. And all it is the strongest tadpoles predate on the weakest tadpoles, and all you're doing is they eventually start attacking the tadpoles' tails and they just eat each other. Toadpoles, as in cane toads, do the same thing. They eat each other as well. And even sometimes toads will come in and eat the spawn as well from another toad. So toads eat each other a lot, but so do tadpoles and frogs. One thing I would suggest too is tadpoles, as I've mentioned, eat algae, eat other things that have fallen into the water, but don't feed them fish food flakes. From a commercial shop, you may find that you get deformities in the frogs because their fish food flakes are predominantly protein and they want to eat algae predominantly. Even though they do eat each other and they eat other creatures, they only eat them after they're dead. You don't see a tadpole eating a live creature. They only eat those things when they're dead and decomposing in the pond. So it's not like you see a tadpole taking on a live frog. If the frog's dead and has died in the pond, they'll eat it, but not as a live animal. Not generally, anyway. Sometimes people ask me about fish and they say, well, why don't you put fish in your ponds? Look, I don't put fish in my ponds because I have a lot of predators in the garden already and have a lot of predators in the water already. So, for instance, a big predator here for tadpoles and frogs is a keelback, a freshwater snake. Grows about so long. I see it in all my ponds. They love eating tadpoles and love eating frogs. So that's one animal that's in the water that will eat those animals so I don't introduce fish, because fish will also predate on the tadpoles, the tadpole eggs. If you do want to introduce fish, there's a few fish that we sometimes call safer fish, where they're supposed to be safer for the tadpoles. So Pacific blue eyes, fly speckled hardyheads, and crimson spotted rainbow fish. They're 3 species that are native to this region, and they have been known to be safer. But I've also been away for the weekend, had fresh spawn in a fish tank with crimson spotted rainbow fish, and there were baby new hatchlings of tadpoles, and I've come back home on the weekend and they're all gone. Every single one's been eaten. So they are safer fish, but the fish still need to eat, and the tadpoles still have to be big enough to be safe. So generally I wouldn't introduce any fish into my ponds. And then people then say, well, what about mosquitoes? You must have mosquito problems. I have mosquito problems like everyone else does when there's a huge rain event on, but generally I don't have mosquito problems. In the water, there's a lot of things that eat mosquito larvae. Not tadpoles, but other things that eat mosquito larvae. So the thing that eats mosquito larvae here the most is dragonflies. Generally, dragonfly larvae happily eat mosquito larvae, happily eat tadpoles. So again, I've got dragonflies all through the garden and through the property, and I have multiple species of those, and they're all in the ponds. So dragonflies always have their juvenile stage in the water. And they are voracious eaters. They eat everything they can grab hold of. So again, there's another thing in the water that is naturally occurring from the dragonflies laying their eggs, but I don't have fish because I already have enough things eating those tadpoles in the water. Also, we've also got other species of snakes that eat frogs and tadpoles. We have also yabbies. Yeah, I have yabbies in some of my ponds as well, freshwater crayfish, and they love eating tadpoles. I used to watch them eat my tadpoles in a fish tank at home, so they happily grab hold of a tadpole and eat that as well. But we're going to move into another part of the garden now and discuss some other topics. Thank you.